So now that the instances of modern slavery are being identified and we're talking about them with our portfolio companies, looking at what they are in practice doing to remediate the victims. So it's not just remediating the risk to their business, which is also very important from an investment management perspective, but it's really focusing in on how you are remediating and making right the wrong to those people. So having a victim-centered approach to remediation.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and elders past and present. In today's episode, we're going to tackle a major ESG issue, modern slavery. To help us unpack this issue as it relates to the investment community in Australia, we chat with Charlotte O'Mara, Head of Responsible Investment at Challenger. Charlotte, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Before we begin, a very quick primer. In Australia, we are very fortunate that there is a project called the Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking Asia Pacific, or IAST-APAC, that is tackling modern slavery head-on. How big is IAST? We're talking about 50 investors with 12 trillion in assets under management, and they work together with the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, or ACSI, Walk Free, and the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, or FAST initiative. Now, there are plenty of concerning stats about modern slavery globally, but I'll mention one that affects us dearly. In 2021, data shows that there were 41,000 individuals living in modern slavery in Australia. That's 41,000. And that is up from 15,000 in 2018. Around the world, almost 50 million people are living in modern slavery, and 29 million are in the Asia Pacific. And I think it's important for us here in Australia because that is our neighboring countries where this is clearly a major problem. So, Charlotte, once again, thank you for joining us. We'll start first with if you can give us a bit of background on Challenger and the genesis of your efforts to tackle modern slavery.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Look, Challenger is an ASX-listed company. We have a life insurance business that provides retirement income solutions to Australians. And we also have a funds management business, which consists of Challenger Investment Management, which is a fixed income investment manager, and Fidante Affiliates, which comprises of around 17 individual affiliate investment teams. And that's a multi-asset class suite of boutique investment managers. And for us, modern slavery is an investment risk issue, and it's also part of our obligations under the UN guiding principles to consider human rights impacts and the risk to people. So we started in 2019 with a cross-functional working group, the Modern Slavery Working Group, and that comprised people from the investment teams, responsible investment, my area. We also had people from risk, legal, and our procurement function. And we came together as part of our obligations as a reporter under the Modern Slavery Act to work out how best we can embed a modern slavery framework across our business. But my particular focus area is on the investment function. So through that working group, we've developed a comprehensive risk assessment process where we assess the risks in our supply chain and our investments. We've also developed the ability to engage with our investment managers and our investment teams across the Fidante Affiliates and also across Challenger Life Company and Challenger Investment Management. And then we have supported them to engage with their own portfolio companies on this big issue. I really appreciated your introduction, highlighting that this is such a big issue globally, but not just globally. It's also an issue in Australia. So a lot of our investment teams on the Fidante side invest in the ASX 200. And initially when we started this piece of work, there was the question from some of the investment teams about, does this issue impact at the ASX 200? And through the education sessions that we've had with those teams, they now understand that it is an issue and it's hidden in plain sight in Australia. And so for us, assessing the risk to people is not just a responsible, ethical way to do business, which is very important to us, but we also see it as a financial risk to our investment portfolios.
Absolutely. I truly admire your work on this. As I was looking at your background, you are involved in several working groups, and maybe we can talk about that. So, for example, You're part of the RIA working group. So we talk to RIA a lot on this podcast. You're also part of the FSC working group, the Financial Services Council. So can you tell me a little bit about the work that you do? What are the similarities and differences? Just to give our listeners a flavor of, well, what is the community doing? We're not just talking about the fund managers, but the super funds, but also these industry organizations.
Yes, so we believe that collaborative engagement is an incredibly important part of ESG issues, and collaborating with our peers and our other investment managers, and particularly the super funds on these issues, allows for us to progress as an industry. So if we think about the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, when that first came into effect, the industry gathered together as part of these working groups. These working groups were formed really in response to that legislation. And what we did as a collective is we worked through how best we can meet our obligations under this new reporting regime in a similar way to the way that investors are gathering now on climate, which is obviously a separate topic. But it's a very similar approach that 5 years ago we were gathering together on modern slavery and working through each of the issues. All of the working groups that you've mentioned, so the FSC ESG working group and the RIA Human Rights working group, which we are a part of, and we're an active member of RIA, and also the Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking initiative, are all focused on policy advocacy. So that's where the similarity is. So when there was the Macmillan review of the Modern Slavery Act that was initiated by the government, all of the working groups came together to provide input into that review. And similarly now, the Attorney General has opened a consultation on the Modern Slavery Act review and some of the issues that they want to take forward into potentially legislative change. So all three working groups are working on a response to that consultation. So we are actively part of those working groups. I think where they differ is in the RIA Human Rights Working Group. What we really value in that working group is it's not just focused on modern slavery, but it looks at human rights issues more broadly. So I mentioned earlier the UN Guiding Principles, which asks investors and businesses across the world to focus on human rights due diligence and the responsibility of protecting human rights in our business conduct. So the RIA Human Rights Working Group really focuses on modern slavery and other human rights issues. They've recently released a toolkit to help investors on broader human rights issues. And a couple of years ago, we were also part of the group that came together to work on a conflict toolkit on how conflict geopolitically impacts risk to people and how investment managers should be thinking about the risk to people in conflict-affected zones. The Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking is great because it focuses in on modern slavery specifically. And so we have knowledge sharing events, policy advocacy, and we've come together on sign-on letters on a number of important issues over the years as well. So each of the working groups that we're a part of really contribute in their own unique way to the dialogue around modern slavery in Australia.
I think it's quite important that this is a concerted effort across the investment community and across different working groups. And really, again, just a reminder for our listeners who are listening to this and going, Michelle, well, what is modern slavery? And it is the umbrella term where you're really looking at crimes. These are crimes. We're talking human trafficking, forced labor, the worst forms of child labor, and debt bondage. And this is just so relevant to us right now as we go through, for example, in the IT, the manufacturing sector, and certainly more recently, I'd like to mention tariffs, because this seems to touch every aspect of global trade. Now we're talking about supply chains as well. Any potential impact on the progress of modern slavery frameworks, especially in these manufacturing-heavy sectors that I've mentioned. What's new right now? What do you think are the more pressing challenges?
I think mentioning tariffs is incredibly relevant to this issue. As you said, tariffs touches everything, and modern slavery is no exception to that. So companies that are already operating in an environment where their tariffs are impacting their businesses and their costs and their profitability and their revenue, they will be then looking potentially to cheaper forms of labour to help and support them in their operations. And they may be also looking to suppliers that are reducing the cost of labour to reduce their costs. So there is a risk that when we think about the impact of tariffs, if tariffs are going up disproportionately, then companies are going to try and cut costs elsewhere. And that's where the risk to people really increases. I think also if we look at the global situation around forced labour import bans, there are a number of forced labour import bans globally, particularly if we think about big jurisdictions such as the EU and the US. We also have forced labour import bans in Canada. So with the forced labour import bans, that's preventing some companies from importing into those jurisdictions. And if Australia doesn't implement a similar ban, a forced labour import ban here, then we are at risk of becoming potentially a dumping ground for forced labour goods. And I think investment managers, particularly those with exposure to the ASX 200 in at-risk sectors, as you mentioned, resources and extractives is an at-risk sector. If we think about some of the issues around EVs and the renewables sector, so if we look at the manufacturing of some of the cobalt that goes into lithium batteries, there have been some issues there that have been uncovered. Solar panels is a continuing issue around modern slavery risk. So there is a potential that investment managers need to be aware that there could be those goods coming into Australia that are at greater risk. Now, the Labor government has committed in this term of government to implement their own forced labour import ban in Australia. We are yet to see that develop. It is early in the term of that Labor government, but it's one that investors really need to watch as a risk area in modern slavery, particularly for the at-risk sectors that you've mentioned.
I'm surprised that we don't have a forced labor ban. I would have thought we'd be like one of the first countries to have it. So what would be a realistic timetable for that you would see that, or is it just totally uncertain at the moment?
At the moment, it's uncertain. It's certainly something that, as part of the Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking, the collective of investors are supportive of this forced labour import ban, and we are also, as part of that, supportive. But I think in terms of timeframes, the Labor government have committed to it, but they've got a number of different priority areas that they're focused on as they come into the next term of government. And I think probably the first step for them is the Modern Slavery Act consultation. Looking at the issues paper that was released a few years ago, the government has in principle accepted 25 out of 30 of the recommendations of the issues paper review, the Macmillan Review. So they're working through each of those areas at the moment, consulting with industry, and they'll do a broad consultation, which is underway at the moment and closes in early September, and then they're going to do a targeted consultation. So I would expect to see early next year some movement in the regulatory landscape of modern slavery for the Labor government.
That's great to hear. Now let's talk about modern slavery statements and roadmaps. I was at an investor conference where a super fund did a fantastic job talking about what they've done in this area. Can you just kind of give us a little bit more of a background? What's happening here? Are there more super funds doing best practice work around modern slavery?
Yes. So those of us who have been part of this journey ever since the Modern Slavery Act came into effect in 2020 when the first statements were released, we would all reflect on how far we've come as an industry and how many investment managers and super funds have refined and implemented more sophisticated roadmaps and frameworks over time. And when we look back to where we started from and where we are today, we've come such a long way. I think I can talk to Challenger and what we do every year. We do an annual top-down modern slavery risk assessment across all of our investments, both the Fidante affiliates and also our Challenger Life Company investments. And as part of that, we use there are many resources and toolkits across the market that we use, including the Global Slavery Index, which is published by Walk Free. And we use that to really map the sector where we are exposed from a sector risk perspective and a geographic risk perspective. And we have a methodology where we develop scores around that. And then we look at what those portfolio companies are doing themselves to mitigate the risk of modern slavery. And so we've got a methodology where we draw many different data points from across different data providers, different frameworks, and we look at how effective those portfolio companies are at mitigating those risks and what the transparency is around their reporting. And ultimately what that gets us to is a residual risk score, where we can map what the modern slavery risks are and develop an action plan for our at-risk investments across our portfolios. And we have a similar exercise for our supply chains. Now, the super funds in Australia have similar approaches. Each of them have different frameworks. They utilise different data providers and different sources. And I think where we are at in terms of our frameworks and our roadmaps is we're in a really good spot with risk assessment. I think that the super funds and many investment managers in the market are actively assessing their risks and identifying instances of modern slavery that they are engaging on with their portfolio companies, which is really good. The next step is going to be looking at, I guess, two key areas in refining our frameworks going forward. One is remediation. So now that the instances of modern slavery are being identified and we're talking about them with our portfolio companies, looking at what they are in practice doing to remediate the victims. So it's not just remediating the risk to their business, which is also very important from an investment management perspective, but it's really focusing in on how you are remediating and making right the wrong to those people. So having a victim-centred approach to remediation. And the second is conducting broader human rights due diligence. So I think modern slavery due diligence is in a really good place in the market, particularly among our asset owners, but really focusing on broader human rights and particularly the geopolitical landscape with conflict. How the broader human rights due diligence is impacted by conflict is another area that I think investors need to refine as a go-forward position.
I like the idea that you're now taking on a victim-centered approach, because this is not just saying, hey, we are a great fund manager or a great super fund because we are monitoring what's happening in modern slavery for our stakeholders. But now you're saying we also want to make sure we look after those who have been victimized by this or taken advantage of by, say, the lack of a forced labor ban, for example. So with all this happening, what do you hope to achieve in terms of advocating for the rights of workers against modern slavery? So you've mentioned the victim-centered approach, but are you getting a good kind of set of feedback from the companies, the owner companies, or are you getting pushback? Because then this is another expense in their P&L, if you like.
I think modern slavery and thinking about the risk to people has been such a different way to think about investment risk. And so I think that the portfolio companies that we've engaged with have come on board with that set of thinking. And I think everybody, if they think about the vulnerability to people and the impact to people, they don't want to be, the vast majority of people across the market don't want to be associated with any kind of business activity that is going to severely and detrimentally impact people in the way that we have seen in some cases of modern slavery. So I think that in Australia in particular, the market is familiar with this risk to people definition and thinking about investment risk in that way and modern slavery risk in that way. The victim-centric remediation approach is an ongoing focus area for us. Some great work that was undertaken by the Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking initiative that we were also a part of was a letter to the Attorney General advocating for a national victims compensation scheme. Now, you may ask, what does that have to do with investors? But what we believe at IAST is that it closes the loop around remediation. So as it currently stands, you can identify a risk or an instance of modern slavery. You can assess how severe that risk is, and you can work with the company on remediation. But as it is a federal law, and there's no compensation scheme at the federal level, it is only at the state level. So victims are not compensated appropriately. There's no legal mechanism to protect them, to allow them to be compensated. And that compensation allows them to get their life back on track. So we believe that a national victims compensation scheme would allow those individuals to receive compensation and close the loop on that remediation, to give them a fresh start and to allow them to get their lives back on track. And we have worked closely with Jennifer Byrne from Anti-Slavery Australia, who has advocated quite vocally on this issue across Australia. The government is yet to implement this national scheme, but IAST and the investors associated with IAST are still strongly advocating for this compensation scheme as a way to really have that victim-centric focus of remediation.
I like the sound of that. I think Jennifer Byrne, she needs no introduction. She's been campaigning, advocating for decades. And I'd love for us to be back on the pod talking about this and saying, yep, It's all done. We've got the compensation scheme. Now, anything else on this topic that you'd like to share with our listeners? Any new legislation coming out or any kind of initiative again from IAST, for example?
So I think I mentioned earlier that the federal government is consulting on the Modern Slavery Act review and strengthening the Modern Slavery Act. So at the moment, that's a broad consultation, finishes early September. Then following that will be a targeted consultation with certain aspects of the market. So that's one to watch out for early next year to see what the government decides to do with the Modern Slavery Act. And hopefully we see some progress. And it would be wonderful to see the National Compensation Scheme implemented as part of that. I think other areas to focus on, I know that the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, James Cockayne, has been doing a lot of work around the renewables sector and publishing some research on the renewables sector and some of the risks specific to EVs, solar panels. So given that there's a big push, which is wonderful in the market towards transitioning towards a sustainable economy and reducing our emissions, it's also important to not forget the impact to people and the risk to people in that. So looking out for some of that work that the New South Wales government is doing around modern slavery, there's a lot of research pieces there. And in terms of our working groups, as I mentioned, RIA has recently published the Human Rights Toolkit, a really comprehensive document that I would encourage all investors to have a look at, because that provides a lot of detail in the latest research around not just modern slavery, but human rights issues more broadly.
Well said. Well, we'll definitely add a link in our show notes for the Human Rights Toolkit. Charlotte, I just feel like this 15, 20 minutes is not long enough to talk about modern slavery. We hope to have you back. But I just feel like we now have a good grounding on what's happening, at least in the next 12 months. And once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This is The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.